We've had enough news lately that I feel like, yeah, we probably need to update these rankings. Got to move T. Higgins up after the extension. But tier 1 doesn't change. Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson. Go back, look at Jamar last year. Triple Crown winner. I mean, hell, he almost won me the Flock League. Thank you, Chase. But this is a wide receiver that is sitting at 19.6 fantasy points per game throughout his NFL career. Justin Jefferson is right there at 19.4. Obviously, Chase had the monstrous season last year, and Chase has the much better quarterback situation going into the future, while Chase should be undoubtedly the #1 wide receiver in Dynasty rankings, plus you get the extra year in age. Now, really the only point you're going to have an argument inside the top 5-ish rankings is if you're going to be ranking Puka Nacua or CeeDee Lamb at 3. Now, if you wanted to make an argument, well, Mason, now Davante Adams is in Los Angeles. Davante Adams is going to be able to command a higher target share than what Cooper Kupp did last year. And if you want to make an argument to take Lamb ahead of Puka Nacua for that reason, or that Dak has the longer runway than what you're going to see with Stafford, I'm completely fine with it. My thing is, Puka Nacua is like 2 years younger than CeeDee Lamb. Also, if you look at this past season, Puka Nacua is sitting there at about 19 fantasy points per game in comparison to CeeDee Lamb at 17.5. Now, of course, you can make the case that you had Cooper Rush for the second half of the season for Lamb, and Lamb should be better this next year. I think if you flip it for like underdog drafts, redraft leagues, I will be taking Lamb ahead of Puka, but given the age advantage that you're going to get with Puka Nacua, I think I have to take him at Dynasty. I'm going over looking at Malik Neighbors. I understand some people are going to be ranking Brian Thomas over Neighbors. Here's my thought process. Malik Neighbors was the better wide receiver at LSU when they were on the same team. Malik Neighbors goes higher in the NFL draft. We were all in agreement that Neighbors was the better prospect. Malik Neighbors averages 18.2 fantasy points per game in comparison to Brian Thomas at 16.7 when Neighbors had worse quarterback play than Brian Thomas Jr. So if Neighbors was better in college on the same team, Neighbors got drafted higher in the NFL draft. And if Malik Neighbors had the better rookie season from a points per game perspective in a worse situation, I would make the argument that Malik Neighbors should probably be ahead of Brian Thomas in Dynasty leagues. Now, given the quarterback situations that both wide receivers should have in 2025, I'm completely fine if you want to take Brian Thomas ahead of Neighbors in redraft or best ball. But again, this is Dynasty. I am trying to lean a little bit more with the talent over the situation for these guys. Neighbors, bona fide stud. I'm going over and looking at our next guys with Amon-Ra St. Brown, Nico Collins. I think that you can differentiate them between the prior players, and that with Nico and Amon-Ra St. Brown, they're getting to the point in their respective NFL careers where obviously they're not going to fall off anytime soon, but it's not like you're going to see a ton of value accruement. You are looking at Amon-Ra St. Brown now going into his 5th NFL season. You're looking at Nico Collins going into his 5th NFL season as well. So I would make the argument that they're going to fall into the bucket of players where you're looking at them on contending builds. Whereas if I was a rebuilder, I'm actually throwing Nico Collins on the trade block. I'm actually going to be throwing Amon-Ra St. Brown on the trade block. Now, again, I don't expect the production to fall off in 2026, 2027. So it's not like you absolutely have to sell them on a rebuilding team. But I think if you would be able to go through and say, move off of Nico Collins, pick up a younger wide receiver, like someone we're going to talk about in a minute with Xavier Worthy, plus some extra draft capital, say the 103. Like if you could sell Nico for Worthy in the 103 on a rebuilding team, that would be something I consider, whereas there's no real reason to do so if you're looking at the Malik Neighbors, the Brian Thomases of the world that are going into year 2. And for that reason as well, I would prefer the 101 with Ashton Jeanty over these veteran wide receivers. And of course, we are going to be looking at the rookie pick in terms of how we are evaluating it against the veterans at this point, because nobody's had the rookie drafts yet, right? If you're making trades and you're using these rankings, you're going to be trading rookie picks, not the actual rookies. After the NFL draft, we will be updating this list with the actual rookie players rather than the rookie picks. If you wanted to see my rookie rankings, you can actually always check those out over on flockfantasy.com. That's where all the updated rankings are. That's where the trade finder is, trade calculator is. You can link your team with the site. Obviously, so much going on over there on the site. And I'll leave that link in the description and the comment section. So many cool free tools. What I'd recommend doing if you haven't already, if you play on Sleeper, definitely go and link your Dynasty team with the site, because again, it's completely free. You can see the power rankings of your league, and you can see exactly what you need to be working on to try to build a better squad for 2025. But moving over to our next tier, we're going to be looking at Drake London. With London, I want to say that it was a massive hit from a dynasty perspective if you went into him last year. But obviously, everybody had the expectations he was taking a massive jump forward, right? That's exactly what he did, though, where you see him move from 10.9 fantasy points per game up to about 16.5. And London's still incredibly young. I mean, Drake London this past season was actually sitting here at 23 years old. So if you look at the historical comps for Drake London's age 23 year and what those players did the following season at 24, you had CeeDee Lamb, Jamar Chase, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Larry Fitz, Marquise Colson, Calvin Johnson, Stephon Diggs, Hakeem Nicks, Andre Johnson. The median outcome for the following season was about 17, 18, 19, 20 fantasy points per game and a half PPR format. Drake London is on the trajectory to be an elite fantasy wide receiver. He is still incredibly young. Obviously, a lot hinges on Michael Penix, which we don't really know what to expect at this point. I'm going over and looking at Ladd McConkey. Ladd McConkey, also phenomenal season. Now, with that being said, Ladd McConkey also just played his age 23 year, the same as Drake London. So definitely an older rookie, right? He came in and the expectations were that he's going to be pro ready. He steps into an offense that really needs some help at wide receiver, but you can't just say, oh, we knew he was going to be ready year one, so we should ignore the production. No, I mean, the production was phenomenal, right? I mean, you're actually looking at a player that was able to average over 15 fantasy points per game as a rookie. If you look at his historical comps going into his age 24 season, you have guys like Tyreek Hill, AJ Green, DJ Moore, Brandon Cooks, Jeremy Maclin, DJ Chark, T. Higgins, Sidney Rice, Nate Burleson. If you're looking at the median range of outcomes here, however, it's not up to like the 18, 19 fantasy points per game that we've seen historically with that Drake London type. It's instead closer to like the 14, 15 fantasy points per game, but still, obviously, very strong wide receiver option. Jackson Smith-Njigba will be our next guy. JSN's the one that has everything changing in his offense, right? You have no Lockett, you have no DK. He's the last man standing, but also you have no Geno Smith, and instead you are going to be bringing in Sam Darnold. I think some people would make the argument, and I'm not going to argue against it, that that is actually going to be an upgrade here. And now, of course, if you were looking at the raw counting stats for Jackson Smith-Njigba, looks phenomenal. I mean, almost hits 1,200 receiving yards, has 100 receptions. Now, of course, he played 17 games. So if you're actually taking the per game numbers, a little bit less exciting, but still great. Averaged almost 15 fantasy points per game and was very young, right? Was 22 this past year, so I believe he's actually younger than Ladd McConkey. And the historical comps look great, 15, 16 fantasy points per game. Will be very interesting to see how he plays alongside Cooper Kupp, that is. I'm going over and looking at Marvin Harrison. With Harrison, yes, massive bust in comparison to where expectations were last year. In underdog drafts, the dude was getting drafted at the 1-2 turn. In dynasty leagues, people were coming out and saying that he is undoubtedly the best wide receiver prospect since Jamar Chase. You remember Jamar Chase's rookie season where he comes through and, I mean, on the whole, he averages about 18 fantasy points per game. Obviously, a lot of that was actually done on the back end where he was a league winner. Harrison, far from that. Harrison about 11.5 fantasy points per game. And what's actually funny is he did quite well in terms of his touchdown rate. He had 8 touchdowns through 62 receptions. So it's not like we can say, oh, okay, well, yeah, he just got unlucky with touchdowns. No, the volume wasn't particularly there. I mean, through 17 games, he had 116 targets. You actually had Trey McBride as that top target earner for most weeks here in Arizona. But Harrison was very young, right? He was 22 years old this past season. If we're going and looking at the historical comps for his age 22 year, you have guys like Calvin Johnson in 2007, Drake London from 2023, Deshaun Jackson in 2008, Stephon Diggs 2015, Andre Johnson 2003, Des Bryant 2010, Dante Moncrief, Torrey Smith, Robert Woods. If you're looking at the expectation for this following season, the historical comps have him at about 15 to 16 fantasy points per game at 23 years old. And it's not like the situation's getting much worse. So I think expectations were just a little unreasonable with him year one. And I would be completely fine buying low on him. I mean, if you're comparing where we have him with rookie picks at the moment, I think we have him right there around the 103, 104 range, where you're essentially determining, do we want to just double down on the pre-draft evaluation process of Marvin Harrison Jr., or do you want to hit the reset button with somebody like Ted McMillan? So really is going to be up to you on that front, but I wouldn't fault anybody for going through and buying low. AJ Brown, kind of know who he is, right? This is going to be an asset that really only makes sense on a contending build. He's going to be 28 years old this next season. If you look at what he has done over the past 3 years, you have seen the points per game fall every year of his Eagles career from 17.5 to 17 and now down to about 16.5. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that the Eagles have skewed much more run heavy as they added Saquon Barkley back in. But I mean, I don't know. I think if you're a contending team, there's no reason why you'd go through and look to sell AJ Brown. You could very easily pencil out low end wide receiver 1 production. T. Higgins will be our next name. With Higgins, if you look at the points per game from this past year, you'd make an argument that, oh, okay, well, he should be much higher than this. He should be higher than JSN, higher than Harrison, higher than AJ Brown in these dynasty ranks. But I would want to take a step backwards. It's not like Higgins is just now finally ever seeing the situation where he's with Chase and Burrow, right? I mean, we've already seen this play out for pretty much the past 4 years in Cincinnati. And if you look at the actual fantasy points per game through his Cincinnati Bengals career, T. Higgins is sitting a lot closer to like 14.5 fantasy points per game, where he is more so a high-end wide receiver 2 in fantasy rather than that mid wide receiver 1 that he was this past year, where Joe Burrow was out there just crushing pretty much every NFL number when it comes to passing volume, which based off how the Cincinnati Bengals defense projects to be this next season, very much could be a real possibility. But also you can say, okay, well, maybe there's just a slight chance that Higgins actually does come back down to earth, and that 18.5 points per game, which is much higher than we've seen throughout his entire NFL career, does look to be just a little bit of an outlier. But great that he gets the contract extension in Cincinnati. That is 100% what you were wanting to see. Garrett Wilson, I'd make the argument, kind of loses free agency here. Wilson's been great, where this past season, the dude had over 100 receptions. If you look at over the past 3 years, he is averaging close to 160 targets per season. He has never missed a game in his NFL career. But now you have Justin Fields coming over. While Fields, I think, can be a great fantasy quarterback himself, of course, the issue is going to be what we've seen historically is Justin Fields is not going to put up passing volume. Justin Fields is actually going to be a quarterback that handicaps his top wide receivers. DJ Moore 2 years ago looked decent, but if you look at the larger sample, it is very difficult to project out Justin Fields to be supporting top end wide receiver 1s. Wilson averaged about 14.8 fantasy points per game this past season. I don't necessarily see how that goes up, but again, super safe bet. Like, he's been a target hog in his entire NFL career. He's going to be 25 years old this season. So, I mean, you know who you're buying. I just think the situation's kind of ugly. Now, I am kind of going out on a limb here with this Xavier Worthy ranking. I do think that there's a pretty big teardrop between Garrett Wilson and the rest of the wide receivers in Dynasty. And with Xavier Worthy, I know if you're just looking at the regular season, it's not like the fantasy points per game popped off the page. He was averaging about 11 fantasy points per game, right? And honestly, the target numbers weren't particularly there, where the man had 98 targets through 17 games played. Where you actually saw this fantasy production come from is ran hot with touchdowns. He had 9 touchdowns with only 98 targets. But again, this is a big play wide receiver. This is going to be somebody that you are looking for splash plays. He's not Amon-Ra St. Brown. We know he's never going to get to 10 plus targets a game. If that does happen, he will break fantasy football. But you are attached to Mahomes. I think that this was pretty much the bottom end range of outcomes if you were looking at passing volume expectations over the next 4 to 5 years in Kansas City. And I don't necessarily know if we're going to see the Chiefs offense be this run heavy every single season going into the future. Now, of course, I'm not going to sit here and make the argument, oh, we're going to get right back to Patrick Mahomes in 2018. We're going to get the 50 plus touchdown seasons. We're going to get Patrick Mahomes leading the NFL in pass attempts and passing yards. I don't know if we can confidently say that's going to happen within the next 5 seasons, but I think we probably are going to see a little bit of a more happy medium between those two outlier type years from what we had this past season and what we've seen with Patrick Mahomes at the very top of the league with passing volume. Xavier Worthy was only 21 years old during his rookie season. And if you look at the historical comps from other 21-year-old wide receivers that put up similar years to Xavier Worthy, you had Josh Gordon, JSN, Percy Harvin, DeAndre Hopkins, Jordan Addison, Drake London, Jerry Jeudy, Elijah Moore, and Antonio Bryant. And I'm fine buying that profile when he's attached to Mahomes. And I think the legal concerns aren't going to be a big deal based off what I've read. But of course, that will be something to keep in mind. I'm going over and looking at Rome Odunze. Rome has to be a massive riser with how the Chicago Bears offense has really invested into the offensive line, plus obviously brought over Ben Johnson, who was able to actually make Jameson Williams look great this past season, who's been pumping out top-end wide receiver seasons from Amon-Ra St. Brown for years. But it would be, I don't know, a little bit delusional to just ignore what Rome did as a rookie and how it wasn't great, right? I mean, he played 17 games. You have 54 receptions. You have 734 receiving yards. And what you actually see is 8.5 fantasy points per game. So if you ignore the fact that Rome Odunze was a very good prospect coming out of Washington, if you ignore the fact that he was right there as a top 10 NFL draft pick, and if you ignore the fact that Caleb Williams should probably get a lot better going into year 2, the offense should probably get a lot better with the changing coaching staff, plus the investment that this team's made in the offensive line. And if we just look at what similar age 22 wide receiver seasons were in the past, it's very ugly. I mean, you have Travis Taylor, Hollywood Brown, Corey Davis, Romeo Doubs, Titus Young, Tavon Austin, Tyler Boyd, Marlon Brown, Ace Sanders, and Rome Odunze. Like, so you're not really excited about that range of outcomes profile. However, again, if you look at the overall context of the situation, great prospect whose situation just got a hell of a lot better. So I think you can bet on a breakout if you want. Rashee Rice is going to be somebody that is very, very difficult to rank and very difficult to project. If you go over and look at where he's getting drafted in redraft leagues, if you look at where he's getting drafted in underdog drafts at the moment, it's a lot lower than at least I initially expected. Talking with people, they were essentially saying, well, you know what? This Rice injury, you have no idea what to expect with the timeline. It's not like Rice is going to be 100% good to go by week 1. Plus, you also have the suspension concerns in the short term, right? You go over and you look at Rashee Rice. He's going to be 25 years old this next season. He did come into the NFL as a little bit of an older prospect, but you can't deny the fact that he was phenomenal. He was by far and away the wide receiver 1 in Kansas City before the devastating injury. He looked like he was going to be a legitimate league winner. I mean, he was sitting there averaging 21.5 fantasy points per game. So I don't particularly know exactly what we can take away with this Rice profile. This is going to be a player that it's super important to make sure you're staying up to news on as the offseason goes. This ranking with Zay Flowers may be a little bad, to be honest with you. Because if you actually take a step backwards and ignore the noise, ignore the fact that, yes, he is the wide receiver 1 for a really strong Super Bowl contender, the fantasy production's not great. 12.9 fantasy points per game as a rookie, 12.3 fantasy points per game as a second-year player. The touchdowns have been non-existent through his NFL career. You've actually only had a total of 10 touchdowns off of 224 targets. So touchdown rate, very low, which is kind of understandable given the fact you go to the red zone. You're not necessarily thinking, oh, this tiny wide receiver in Zay Flowers is going to be their main weapon over Derrick Henry or Lamar Jackson taking himself off the edge. Zay Flowers also was a little bit of an older prospect coming out, so he is also about to be 25 years old. So I'm going to keep tinkering with these rankings on the site as I always do. And I do think we possibly have to consider moving Flowers down. I'm not too concerned at all about Hopkins coming over. I think Hopkins is a non-factor here, to be honest. Jordan Addison was a wide receiver that we really went out of our way drafting in underdog drafts last year. Made him a most drafted wide receiver at an ADP as a high-end wide receiver 4. And I want to say he absolutely crushed in comparison to what expectations were. The dude averaged over 14 fantasy points per game. And again, the reason why I've liked Jordan Addison for quite some time is this was a Blitnikoff winner. This is a round 1 NFL draft pick. This is a rookie wide receiver that at 21 years old managed to come through and actually average 13 fantasy points per game. Now he improved on that in his second season with arguably worse quarterback play with Sam Darnold. He improved his yards per target up to 8.8. Now, again, what you're going to see in 2025 is 1, a little bit of a wild card situation at quarterback. 2, you're actually going to have TJ Hawkinson fully good to go through the course of the entire season, which concerns me just a bit in terms of the target volume that could take away from Addison. Because while I do really like Jordan Addison, if I'm going to be honest with myself, I would imagine Hawkinson takes the Addison targets, and I don't think Hawkinson's taking the Jefferson targets. Now, with all that being said, if you actually look at what Jordan Addison did at 22 years old, he does have some pretty impressive comps. Chris Godwin, DK Metcalf, Stephon Diggs, Andre Johnson, Jeremy Maclin, George Pickens, Chase Claypool, Darius Slayton, Jordan Addison, and Harrison all had similar age 22 seasons. Going over and looking at Devonta Smith. Smith, a little bit of an older wide receiver in comparison to what you'd expect. Stayed all 4 years at Alabama. Going to be 27 years old this next season. So really, Devonta Smith is that profile that you just kind of want on a contending build. Very similar to A.J. Brown, right? The Eagles are just running it back. We kind of know what to expect. If you're a contender and you need a wide receiver too to give you about 14, 15 fantasy points per game, Devonta Smith's your guy. If you're a rebuilder, it probably makes sense to throw him on the trade block. I would say the same thing with DJ Moore, right? DJ Moore is going to be 28 years old this next season. I'd make the argument that from a redraft perspective, I like DJ Moore a lot more than a lot of these guys on this list. The issue is DJ Moore at 28 years old only makes sense for contending teams. If you're a rebuilding roster, I'm very confident in saying that you should be moving on. But for all the reasons that we laid out, while we think Rome Odunze is going to take a massive step forward this next season in comparison to what we had in 2024, you have with DJ Moore. I mean, this is a much better offensive line. This is a better coaching staff. Keenan Allen's target volume isn't really going to be there. Caleb Williams probably going to get better year two. So there are a lot of bullish signals for DJ Moore this following season. And you actually saw DJ Moore's age 27 here look very similar to what you had with Cooper Kupp back in 2020 before he came out and turned into the Triple Crown winner. Chris Olave are really difficult to rank, right? I think the New Orleans Saints are going to be in play for the #1 overall draft pick in 2026. A very bad team, very bad offense this next season. Chris Olave, serious concussion concerns right along with Tua. A massive step backwards this past year, pretty much across the board. And also, you're looking at a wide receiver that has had a very low historical touchdown rate to the point where this is becoming concerning over a large enough sample, where he has only scored 10 touchdowns through 301 targets in his NFL career. Now, maybe if he can find himself out of New Orleans and get attached to efficient quarterback play, maybe that touchdown rate does indeed go up. But this is a receiver that's shown talent early in his NFL career. Was a great prospect coming out of Ohio State. Just so many red flags at this point. Jameson Williams takes a massive leap forward, right? Jameson goes from 2.5 fantasy points per game to 6.5 fantasy points per game, up to 14 fantasy points per game in his third season. Now, of course, you had him coming off a significant injury in year one. In year two, he had the suspension. So, and maybe the stars finally aligned. Maybe everything was exactly where it needed to be this past year, but now you have the offensive coordinator changing. Jameson did a lot of this with efficiency, not necessarily volume. He actually only had 58 receptions. He actually only had 91 targets. Yards per target, obviously insane, as you'd imagine with these field stretching options. I would definitely like Jameson Williams more in a half PPR format, non-PPR format, than I would in a full PPR league. Jalen Waddle will be our next guy. If you're looking at Waddle, I think you can make an argument that we even have him too high here. I mean, this dude's going to be 27 this next year, right? So you're not really wanting Waddle on a rebuilding roster. You see the fall off in production come in a big time way. I mean, we're over the past, really every year of his NFL career, I guess he's gotten worse, where you go from 15.4 fantasy points per game down to 15.2, down to 14.2, and now the big drop off down to 10. But again, I do want to remind you that a lot of this is noise with Tua missing time. Now, it is going to be a concern, of course, that Tua has been dealing with concussions, and that's probably not going to change anytime soon. But if you are looking at these splits with and without Tua for Jalen Waddle here, Waddle has actually averaged 15 fantasy points per game in games where Tua has played. However, that falls down to 9.41 in the games where Tua has missed. So if you think Tua is going to be able to string together a fully healthy season, and if you think that maybe Tyreek is slowing down just a bit, maybe Waddle is able to get back closer to that 15 points per game mark that you saw early on in his NFL career, but that will be something to monitor, of course. Going over and looking at Tyreek Hill. Tyreek Hill, very similar story. Like if we're going to look at over the past 3 seasons for Tyreek, in games where Tua's played, he's sitting up at about 20.5 fantasy points per game. And that number pretty much gets cut in half in the games where Tua misses, down at 11.5 fantasy points per contest. Now, again, this is a speedster wide receiver going into his age 31 season that did just see a dramatic fall off in points per game from about 23.5 fantasy points per game to about 13. He really only has 1 year left of guaranteed money on his deal. And then afterwards, you actually, I want to say, not can you, but most likely you will see them decide to move on from Tyreek Hill, where he's sitting there with $15 million guaranteed, but with a $52 million cap hit in 2026. So you'd assume that they move on next season, unless Tyreek takes a massive step forward. But if you're looking at the range of outcomes from similar age 30 seasons to Tyreek Hill since the year 2000, really the median projection should be about 13 fantasy points per game. So not great. Terry McLaurin has the best year of his NFL career with the best quarterback of his NFL career this past season, where Scary Terry comes through and he averages almost 16 fantasy points per game. The touchdowns are finally there. What's funny is if you actually look at all the volume numbers, they've stayed very consistent through his entire NFL career, where every season the man is around 1,000 receiving yards, not much higher, not much lower, but this is the first time that he has actually scored more than 7 touchdowns with 13. So it's all about Jaden Daniels. Now you do have Deebo Samuel coming in. This is the last year of Terry McLaurin's deal. But I don't know. I think if you're a contending team, you should be excited. Again, I want to stress if you're a contending team, because Terry McLaurin is going to be 30 this next year. He was in the same draft class as DK Metcalf, but Terry McLaurin stayed like 5 years at Ohio State, so he was just extremely old coming out, where DK came out after 3 years at Ole Miss. So DK is only going to be 28 years old this next year. He gets traded and signed to a massive deal with Pittsburgh. We don't necessarily know the quarterback situation for the Steelers. I would be very surprised if it is indeed Mason Rudolph come week 1. If that does happen, I think DK Metcalf's going to have to fall down these rankings. And again, completely understand why people maybe would be a little upset with our DK Metcalf ranking here. But if we try to be objective about this, DK Metcalf through his entire NFL career, minus the year 2020, has been a wide receiver 3 in fantasy. Like 11.5 fantasy points per game. Then 2020, he has the massive year 17 fantasy points per game, but then down to 14.5. Then down to 13.5, then to 14, then at 12.5 this past season. And now all of a sudden you're in what I perceive to be a more questionable situation, where we don't necessarily know exactly what the quarterback situation is going to be. So I'm not in love with Metcalf. Metcalf is going to be right ahead of Godwin for us, just because Godwin is going to be a little bit older here. Of course, Godwin drafted back in 2017, but he was only 20 years old coming out of Penn State. A Godwin re-signs with Tampa. Absolutely love to see it. I have a feeling that Godwin's going to be my most drafted redraft wide receiver if his price stays the same in best ball as it has been. You don't necessarily know exactly how that ankle injury is going to develop. That will be something to keep your eye on, but absolutely perfect that he finds himself back in Tampa. I'm going over and looking at George Pickens. Pickens, similar to like Zay Flowers. You hear a lot about him, but for fantasy purposes, the touchdown rate being so low really does limit him. We're through 293 targets. He's only had 12 touchdowns through his NFL career, averaging about 11.2 fantasy points per game. Now that you have DK Metcalf coming in, the low ceiling for Pickens may even get lower. Our next guy will be Jerry Jeudy. If you're looking at Jeudy, he's only 25, or at least he was 25 this past season in Cleveland. He's going to be 26 this next year. Guaranteed money, where he's pretty much guaranteed to be a Brown in 2025, 2026. Issue is this Browns team is garbage. Quarterback situation is gross, but you can pretty confidently say Jerry Jeudy is the wide receiver 1. You did see a big breakout this past year with about 14.2 fantasy points per game, and that was actually off of only 4 touchdowns. Jerry Jeudy had over 1,200 receiving yards this past season, which is more than we've ever seen from George Pickens. I'm sorry, I'm just going through and looking at the guys above him. Chris Godwin's only had 1 year with 1,200 receiving yards. It's more than you've ever seen for DK Metcalf. It's more than you've ever seen for Terry McLaurin. So it is kind of crazy looking at what Jerry Jeudy was able to do this past year. But again, the quarterback situation is probably going to be a little bit worse if you're just chasing raw volume for fantasy purposes. Going over and looking at Jaden Reed. I'm not a big Reed guy. I mean, if you remember where his dynasty price got after the first month of this past year is kind of crazy, especially for a part-time player that doesn't see a ton of targets. I mean, this dude had 75 targets this past year. You actually see him from year 1 to year 2 go from 94 targets down to 75 despite playing an extra game. It's not like the Packers have so much talent at wide receiver that, oh, that's why Jaden Reed can't get it. No, they have nobody, right? They have nobody. Reed still hasn't been great. Touchdowns have been there, which are great. Big plays have been there. The dude has 17 touchdowns with only 169 targets. But again, I don't necessarily know if we can bank on that coming in the future, especially if the Packers are able to grab a real receiver in the draft. Looking at Brandon Ayuk, seems like he is going to be on the way out in San Francisco. Yes, you have the season-ending injury in 2024, but even before that, the dude was averaging fewer than 9 fantasy points per game. He looked horrible. If you go back 2 years ago, for him to earn that contract extension in 2023, he did post 1,300 receiving yards. But now if you're on the out in San Francisco coming off a season-ending injury where you looked horrible before that even happened, I don't exactly know how excited we can be. Ricky Pearsall looks like he's setting up perfectly though, right? Because if you are looking at Sticky Ricky, this is a player that just dodged Deebo Samuel for target competition this next season. And again, you potentially have Brandon Ayuk on the way out as well. So Sticky Ricky is the last man standing in what perceives to be always a top NFL offense when healthy. I think you have upside here. We saw the really strong finish to the end of the year. Drafted a ton of him in best ball. Him getting shot was the worst thing ever. Going over and looking at Khalil Shakir. I understand a lot of people thought that he was some massive hit this past season, right? I mean, there was a freaking TikTok edit of me saying that Shakir was overrated just because he was a Bill. That's why people knew who he was. And I honestly still kind of stand by. I mean, Khalil Shakir's massive breakout season, the dude was a wide receiver 3 and he averaged 12.2 fantasy points per game. The reason I'm giving Shakir some credit here is he's a 25-year-old wide receiver who just signed an extension to be alongside Josh Allen, right? So he's going to be with one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. He's pretty young. He's getting better. So I think that is something you can be excited about. It's like a low-end wide receiver 2, high-end wide receiver 3 in Dynasty. Mike Evans, it's just very difficult to rank these guys that maybe only 2 or 3 teams in your league are really, really wanting, right? 2 or 3 teams in your league have a serious shot to win the title this season. The man's going to be 32 in 2025. He has no signs at all of slowing down. What's actually funny is over the past 3 years, he's improved his fantasy points per game, going from 15 to 16.5 to 17.2. Again, he got to 1,000 receiving yards this past year, despite only playing 14 games. Through his NFL career, he's averaging 16.3 fantasy points per game, but he was drafted in 2014, so he's going to be playing his 12th NFL season this next year. Courtland Sutton, the best year of his NFL career this past season, 14.1 fantasy points per game. Over the past 2 years, he's actually managed to score 18 touchdowns. Wouldn't it be surprising if Bo Nix was actually able to improve in year 2, while at the same time, there's not a lot of target competition in Denver outside of Courtland Sutton, so he could just be the absolute dominant alpha. Jalen McMillan, I'm not a big fan of. The reason I'm ranking Jalen McMillan here, to be completely honest with you, is I just know his dynasty trade value is going to be higher than where I'd actually rank him. Like if I was doing my legit rankings, I know y'all are going to laugh at this. Maybe you're going to roll your eyes at this. I may rank freaking Quentin Johnston over Jalen McMillan. Like there are a couple wide receivers like Josh Downs. I think you could talk me into ranking him ahead of McMillan. Keon Coleman, I think you could talk me into that. But I have seen like a ton of people really in on McMillan. So I'll rank him here because I know that's where his trade value is. He was at 10.5 fantasy points per game this past year, which is about 2 fantasy points per game more than Rome Odunze. But again, you had no Chris Godwin for a lot of the year. Mike Evans gets banged up as well. And he had 8 touchdowns off 58 targets. Don't think that's sustainable. Davante Adams, it's like a worse Mike Evans, right? I mean, he does actually average 17.2 fantasy points per game this past year. Going over to Los Angeles, though, I would be more surprised if Davante Adams was the wide receiver 1 over Puka Nacua than I would be if Mike Evans was the wide receiver 1 over Chris Godwin. So if I was a contending team and wanted one of these 1-year rentals, I'd probably go with Evans over Adams myself. But I really hope I was able to help you out with this. Again, if you have not done so already, I definitely check out our rookie rankings and all the update to rankings over there on flockfantasy.com. Completely free if you actually want to link your Dynasty League, if you're playing with Sleeper, to see the updated power rankings of your league in particular and maybe get an idea of what your team should be working on. And I'll leave that link to flockfantasy.com in the description and comment section. Ton of stuff going on over there. But really appreciate you and really hope that I get to see you out with the next video.